All right, let's get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Katie Heiserman, and I'm the assistant curator at the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we will be discussing the 10 talents of George Washington with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. All right, so tonight's featured document is a letter from John Adams to Benjamin Rush, dated November 11th, 1807. So keep in mind that that's about 8 years after Washington's death. When people read letters by the founding fathers, they often have certain expectations, and this letter was a little off base from what I expected. So I'm excited to hear what all of you joining us tonight take away from it as well. One thing our collection director, Sandy, pointed out to me earlier is actually how small Adam's handwriting is here and how the lines get even tighter and tighter as he goes along. And I thought that was just so interesting. You can almost feel the energy and concentration he was putting into writing it just by looking at the document. So there's a lot to say about this document. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, the Executive Director of the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon. She has worked with Gilder Lehrman on a number of projects, and we're so excited to have her on Inside the Vault tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to talk about this letter. As Katie said, I started my job as the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library in July. And then I had a book come out about John Adams in September. And I think that John Adams would have been highly entertained by the fact that I spent the first 6 months of my job at the George Washington Library talking about John Adams. And I think he would have found that very funny. And so this letter is such a perfect thing to talk to you all about because it combines my two worlds, my research into John Adams and then also my job talking about Washington. And you will see some of Adams's complex feelings about Washington come forward in this letter. My plan for this evening is to go through the letter to talk a little bit about the people that we will be hearing from and hearing who Adams was talking to, as well as who he was talking about. And then I'll take you through the list that he talks about Washington and some of the backstory of some of that history that he's referencing in this letter to Rush. I will note that we are basically talking about maybe half of the letter. It is so full of material, and there's so much stuff in the beginning about yellow fever and comets and Rush's medical work that you could go a whole other direction with this one letter alone. But then I'm also going to leave time at the end for questions. It's really important for me to be able to answer your questions and to give you more information about what you want to know about. That is always my favorite part, even when I can't see your faces. So please do put your questions into the Q&A. I want to be able to get to those at the end. So our primary participants in this letter, it was a series of exchanges back and forth between John Adams and Benjamin Rush. They had been friends for decades. Benjamin Rush was a doctor who lived in Philadelphia, so they had actually met during the Revolution. They had both been in and out of Congress, and then they resumed their friendship when Adams came back from Europe and, of course, assumed his position as the first vice president. What I love about their friendship is Dr. Rush was among the most radical Democratic Republicans, and Adams, of course, was a moderate, but nonetheless a Federalist. And so they were really quite on opposite ends of a lot of political issues, and yet they had real affection and adoration for one another and for each other's families, and a lot of compassion when the other was going through a difficult moment. Rush has become sort of famous for his really terrible treatments of diseases. He was a big fan of purging and bloodletting, which when you're suffering from something like yellow fever is the exact opposite of what you want to do. You want to stay hydrated, and both of those cures do the opposite. But Rush's other claim to fame was that about 4 years, 5 years after this exchange, he engineered the resumption of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's correspondence. So he was the one that got them to start writing letters again to one another because he was friends with both of them. And he had been pushing and prodding for it for years. John Adams at this point had been the first president. First vice president. He had also been president. He only served one term. He was defeated in the election of 1800 by Thomas Jefferson, his vice president, and then he went home to Quincy, Massachusetts, and he stayed at home at Peacefield, which was his house, for the rest of his life. He did occasionally travel into Boston, but he didn't do much travel other than that. He maintained a steady correspondence with friends and colleagues across the globe. He took great pleasure in his farming, and he regularly would play with his carrots during the day and then go read Cicero at night. So he had a very interesting intellectual life. He was a complex figure, to be sure. He was flawed and he knew exactly what his flaws were. However, none of his descriptions of his flaws that you may have read in Hamilton's writings or Jefferson's writings, or many of the historians since who took Hamilton and Jefferson at their word, are quite as severe as they said. He also had a great sense of humor and joy and love and a really great ability to poke fun at himself. So that is always, I think, worth noting here, and you'll see that sense of humor come up. Can we go to the next slide, Katie? So the purpose of this letter, they're writing back and forth about a number of different sort of high-minded things. And in one of the previous letters, the subject of disinterestedness comes up. And Adams describes disinterestedness as not having a pecuniary or a financial or an emotional interest in service and yet being called to do so anyway. And he says that there are lots of men who feign disinterestedness, especially over the course of history, but there are relatively few exceptions for people who are actually disinterested, and Washington ought to pass for one. That's a direct quote. And so he starts to talk about who Washington was and why he was remarkable and why he is remembered as a hero. And so then Rush makes a number of comments, especially about things that Alexander Hamilton has said, who, of course, Alexander Hamilton has said about George Washington. And there is no one that John Adams disliked more than Alexander Hamilton. He couldn't stand Alexander Hamilton because he felt like he was an upstart. He didn't really know anything. He didn't have a lot of experience, and yet he presumed to lecture everyone under the sun. And that had really come to a head during John Adams' presidency because Hamilton had lectured Adams about foreign policy despite having never served in a diplomatic position. And John Adams had served in pretty much every diplomatic position that one could have in the 1790s. So when Rush mentions Hamilton, it triggers Adams, and he goes into this sort of rant about how Hamilton knows nothing, and then describes what he thinks that Washington actually had to offer. And he lists these 10 talents. And I broke them down so they're a little bit more digestible because there are admittedly a lot of words. So the first thing he says is a handsome face. And I love this because it's a really accurate acknowledgement that humans tend to like people who are attractive. Now, what counts as attractive, of course, has changed over time, but it is a valuable quality to have if you want to be in public service or in a position of power. The French quote at the end that he's referencing here says, "True beauty, true royalty is beauty." And Madame du Barry was the famous mistress of King Charles, I think King Louis the 15th in France. So he's referring to sort of this very famous mistress and saying, true royalty is beauty. Next slide, please. He's also tall and has an elegant form and graceful attitudes and movements. What is very funny about this is just sort of how blunt Adams is about some of the characteristics of Washington. And I think it's worth delving into sort of the symbolic value of some of these things, because I think you all probably heard Washington was really tall. He was taller than everyone, and he kind of loomed over people when he came into the room. But it was very much true at a time when men on average were about 5'6", 5'8" maybe. Washington was between 6 feet and 6'2", depending on what measurements we're looking at. He was very muscular in his physique, especially his lower body, because he rode horses every single day and was considered to be one of the best dancers in all of North America, which at the time was quite a hot commodity to have as a personal characteristic. He also was renowned for his ability to sit on a horse. And Thomas Jefferson, who was not necessarily known for giving compliments to George Washington, said that Washington was the best horseman in the United States. So if we think about the things that we value today, about what we think makes someone attractive, what we think makes someone talented or persuasive, all of the characteristics, or at least the physical characteristics that mattered to the 18th century, also matter today. Sometimes when I am discussing this with students, I say, have you ever been in a room and like a professional basketball player or a professional football player walks in the room, and you know that they are sort of not a normal human because their stature is very different. Washington was very much that way, and he knew how to use it. Washington had a flair for the dramatic, a flair for the theatrical, and knew how to craft a good scene. Perhaps the best example of this is in the summer of 1775 when he arrived for the Second Continental Congress. He showed up in military uniform, knowing that Congress would probably have to create an army and would need to appoint a commander-in-chief. And just in case anyone forgot that he had military service, he was wearing a military uniform to remind them. So the physical attributes, the ability to move gracefully, to not embarrass oneself, are really quite important. Next slide, please. He was also really wealthy. And so this, is something that I think students can probably relate to today. We see people of enormous wealth in positions of political privilege. We see people of enormous wealth having a lot of social impact. Even things like, I can't imagine that this show is particularly popular with your students, but things like the Real Housewives series was just about people who had a lot of wealth and social privilege. And so the concept of someone being wealthy and therefore being interesting is perhaps a human condition. It was also quite useful for the purpose of political service at the time. Washington did not take a salary during the Revolution, and that led him to look extra disinterested, per Adams' first point, and he was able to do so because he didn't need the money. It also helped with things like socializing and hosting, both as a private citizen and as president. He had the money to pay for a really nice house, to have the finest foods and wine on the table, to import Madeira from Europe, to import fine wines and art and the table china to impress those that were at his house. He also, and notably the picture on the right depicts this, owned hundreds of enslaved individuals, which meant that he had the type of labor that could make everyone around him, everyone white around him, their lives easier when they were in his presence. And so that was a notable difference from, say, example, John Adams or John Quincy Adams, who did not have that wealth and did not own any enslaved individuals themselves and instead had to pay for labor. So the idea of having that excess money, those excess funds, were really quite important. There was also a commitment to the idea that the best men should serve in public service at the time in the government, and they should be called to service. And often the best men, and I'm putting that in parentheses because that's what they said, were those that were wealthiest, sort of the natural elite, the landowners, the ones that had a good education, and all of the riches that would come from, in theory, merit or, in some cases, inheritance. Next slide, please. So this is where some of John Adams' snark starts to come out, which I really appreciate. And you can see the cultural difference between Massachusetts and Virginia start to really show. The thing, the best description that I have read of the Adams family is that they are New Englanders from New England, and they very much embody the Puritan spirit, even if they were no longer necessarily as rigid in their religious practices. Certainly culturally, they still embodied that Puritan spirit. And so Virginia culture and other forms of Southern culture were very, very different from what they had experienced. And, we talk about our cultural differences today, and to be sure we have them, but boy, did they have them in the 18th century as well. And he is right. Virginia is extremely clannish. If any of you have done any work into genealogy and you trace your family back to maybe Virginia, it gets incredibly confusing because they all intermarry and they don't go out of Virginia and they all recycle the same names and they're all cousins. And so they really become very clannish in their political persona as well. They did also trumpet their position as the largest state in the Union, the home of George Washington, the home of the commander in chief, the home of the father of the nation, which he was called before he even became president. And so there was a great deal of pride around that state and its role in the nation's founding and its importance in the nation. It continued to have that same sort of identity all the way up through the middle of the 19th century, of course, with the Civil War. But for example, one of the things that James Monroe had to grapple with when he first became president was who to make Secretary of State, because at the time, Secretary of State was very much a stepping stone to the presidency. And the presidency had pretty much been captured by Virginians, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. And he believed that John Quincy Adams was the right person for the job, but he knew that that largely meant that the presidency would probably go to a different state. And he received a lot of criticism for allowing that to happen. So even in the 1810s and 1820s, this was something that was very much front of mind with political choices. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting one because I will admit this is not something that I had really read much about, not necessarily Braddock's defeat, but this interpretation of Braddock's defeat, which is that Washington developed a series of resentments against the British, and he had been treated very poorly by them after serving honorably. He was not given the same sort of commission. He was not given the same sort of position as someone who would receive if they had been born in England, and that was an outrage to a lot of colonists. Now, I knew that Washington felt that way, and I knew that Washington had a lot of resentments, but I didn't know that that was something that had occurred to other Americans at the time. And so I think that it's very interesting that as early as, the 1760s, Washington is starting to become this unifying figure for American resentments against the British. And then by the 1770s, he's a unifying figure as the head of the army. And so the fact that Adams identifies this as the start of his presence as a unifier was something new to me. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's where Adams actually gets into characteristics of what it means to be a great leader, of some of the things that make Washington a successful politician, a successful president, and either beloved or feared or respected by his allies and enemies alike. So, number 8, he possessed the gift of silence. This I esteem as one of the most precious talents. What John Adams did not say there is he esteems it because he himself does not have it, and he cannot keep his mouth shut, even when he knows he really should. So it really takes someone who knows how hard it is to keep your mouth shut to be able to truly appreciate Washington's gift. And Adams was right. Washington didn't speak a whole lot in public. He did prefer to sit back and listen. This was not for lack of opinions, but rather an understand. Well, I think there were a lot of reasons. One, he had dentures. By the time he was president, he only had, I think, 2 teeth left in his mouth, and his dentures were pretty uncomfortable, and they were held in his mouth by springs. And so speaking was actually quite difficult because he didn't have glue holding them in place. But there were, I think, more perhaps respectable reasons as well. He was self-conscious about his lack of formal education. He had stopped education when his father died when he was quite young. And although he had supplemented his education with his own reading, he was constantly buying books for the duration of his life. He understood that he did not have the same sort of schooling as someone like a James Madison or a Thomas Jefferson. 2, he knew he did not have all the answers. He usually showed up to meetings and asked a bunch of questions or had a written list of questions. He did the same at the Constitutional Convention. And he felt that, especially if he was tasked with making a decision, it was better to hear all of the different perspectives before he actually gave his perspective or his opinion on what they should actually do. So, the gift of silence is an important one. 9, he had great self command. This is very true. Washington notoriously had a very fearsome temper. And when he did lose it, which was very rare in his adult life, it was quite fearsome to behold. And yet he learned to control it. He learned to not really show his emotions on his face. He had what we would call a great poker face. And this was both, I think, probably an astute thing to do politically, but it was also in keeping with the social expectations of what it meant to be a virtuous, small r Republican. At the time, sort of the highest level of respectable manhood was this concept of reserve, of kind of an aloofness, of not showing your emotions, keeping them restrained, not showing a lot of excess of feeling. And Washington, because he was, again, self conscious about his lack of schooling, he initially did not have a whole lot of prospects. It wasn't until his older brothers died that he inherited a good fortune. He focused on what he could control, which was his deportment, his personality, his manners, the things that he wanted to do and to try and move up in society. Number 10, when he did lose his temper, the people around him knew how to conceal it and to not allow those weaknesses to show. What I think this reveals is that Washington had a great ability to inspire loyalty and devotion from those around him. The people in his army would often refer to themselves as Washington's army. And in fact, during the Revolution, Congress started doing the same. They referred to the army as Washington's army instead of their army because the troops were so loyal to him that they, if he was not in command, that they would almost certainly desert and go home. This was true later in life. Many of his subordinates in government came from the military and they remained loyal to him until he died and were just incredibly devout to his memory long after he had passed. Now, sometimes that was self-interested. In the case of Alexander Hamilton, when he died, when Washington died, he said that Washington had really kind of been the, I'm paraphrasing here, but had been the ship that he had attached his rowboat to and had followed in his wake. And so he knew that Washington's death was a major blow to his own personal career. And so I think that, while Adams is getting at this concept of covering up the weakness from the public, so perhaps the public doesn't fully know Washington in his full sense or his full personality. Adams is acknowledging that that's a useful thing to have, that is beneficial to have people who actually were willing to cover that up or were willing to go to great ends to serve his interests. And that is really important for a leader. Next slide, please. So here, Adams is sort of concluding about the talents, and he is acknowledging that he hasn't really said anything intellectually about reading or thinking or writing. Usually those are things that we think of when we're thinking about great leaders. At times, when reflecting on Washington's talents, other contemporaries, including Jefferson, who was often quite critical of Washington, acknowledged that Washington wasn't always the greatest innovator of ideas, but had very good judgment. And I think that was something that Adams would usually agree with as well. But rather an understanding that there are a lot of other ways that one can interact with the world, and sometimes the intellectual talents are not the most important. If I may step out of the letter just for a second, if we look at some of the presidents who have been the best, presidents like FDR, he was not necessarily the most intellectual of presidents. He wasn't even necessarily the most innovative. He was really good at surrounding himself with people who had innovative ideas, and he had really phenomenal social skills to kind of get people to do what they want. That is certainly true of people like LBJ. Now, LBJ's social skills were, I think, quite different. He was, there's that famous picture of him kind of leaning over someone and he would kind of browbeat them into doing what he wanted. But sometimes the best politicians are not necessarily the smartest. And in fact, I would maybe argue that some of the smartest presidents, like John Quincy Adams, didn't always benefit from that intelligence in office. Next slide, please. Speaking of John Quincy Adams, one of the things that's amazing about the Adamses is their extraordinary range of interests. And so I just wanted to pull out a couple of little things from the letter just to kind of demonstrate all of the different subjects that are in this one document alone. Here you see Adams speculating that animals and vegetables might have rational feelings and morality, talking about trees and plants and what they want to include in their farm. Adams adored his farm. He just worshipped it. Some of my favorite documents that he created are his diary entries where he's recording things that he did on the farm, and he talks about the dirt that he moved or the wall that he built, or at one point he has a very nasty infestation of worms and he gives them genders, so he calls them he, and he decides these different types of worms are he's and she's. So anyway, I just thought it would be fun to kind of pull out a couple of the other things just to show you the full range of interests. Next letter, please. Now, all of this letter is written in the shadow of what happened during Adams' presidency. And towards the end, he refers to Alexander Hamilton. He refers to Hamilton a lot in his letters, especially in his post-presidential life. And he is talking about a series of events that occurred starting in 1798 into 1799 and actually culminated in the spring of 1800. And this series of events happened because the quasi-war with France between the United States and France had really ratcheted up in Adams's first year of the presidency. France had been seizing American ships, and Adams sent a peace delegation to go to Paris to try and negotiate a settlement. The diplomats were treated terribly. The French demanded bribes and really embarrassing apologies and loans that were against the diplomats' instructions in order to even begin negotiations. And this became known as the XYZ affair. In the aftermath of the XYZ affair, Congress greatly expanded the army from about 2,500 to about 50,000. And so Adams had to figure out what to do with this army. He knew that it was potentially going to be unpopular because Americans were very distrusting of standing armies. Keep in mind, this is really only 20 years after the start of the Revolution, and they were not particularly fond of standing armies then either. He also knew it would be very expensive, and Americans were not particularly interested in paying more taxes in 1798 than they were in 1778. And he knew that the management of the army would be quite complicated. He himself did not have a whole lot of military experience, and his cabinet, namely Secretary of State Timothy Pickering, Secretary of Treasury Oliver Wolcott Jr., and Secretary of War James McHenry, were angling for Alexander Hamilton to be in charge. And again, Adams wanted anyone else. Anyone else would have been totally fine. But he didn't trust Hamilton. He didn't like Hamilton. And frankly, he had a lot of good reason not to trust him, because Hamilton wanted to take this army, march it south through Virginia, crush their political opposition, and then go to South America and stir up some revolutions. So his ideas were a little crazy and deserving of distrust. So what Adams came up with was this idea that if he could have Washington come out of retirement and serve as the commander-in-chief of this army, then it would sort of hold off Hamilton's rush for power. And Washington said yes, as long as he could stay home in Mount Vernon until France actually invaded. What that meant, however, was that the number two was going to be very important, because the number two was going to have all of the day-to-day power. And again, the cabinet pushed for Hamilton, Adams pushed for anyone else. And because Washington and Adams were not in the same city, and they didn't have telephone, the cabinet was able to sort of maneuver Washington into thinking that Adams knew nothing about the military, was being ridiculous, was overly hostile to Hamilton. And Washington ultimately issued an ultimatum to Adams, saying that if he didn't give him the officers he wanted and the rank he wanted, then he would resign. And Adams understood that if Washington resigned, then it would kneecap his presidency, and there was nothing he could do to recover that. So unfortunately, he had to give in, but he then spent the next couple of years finding ways to sort of mitigate the power and, critically, the politicization of this army. It was a very, very political force. Basically, Hamilton was using it as a spoil system for the Federalist Party, and so this was not something that Adams wanted anything to do with. So this first quote that you see here, what he was saying is he should not have appointed Washington, and he should have said no to Hamilton, and he should have brought in some people from the Democratic Republican Party, including Burr and Muhlenberg, who had military experience, to make this force more bipartisan, to make it less of a spoil system for the Federalist Party. And then the second quote, he's talking about what would have happened if there had actually been a war, had this army continued to exist. And this is his answer, that Washington would have been chosen president, and if he had lived, Hamilton would have been appointed commander-in-chief. Now, I don't know that Washington would have accepted the presidency, because Washington really didn't want to go back into politics. He was very, very done with it. But this quote does get at the challenge of being president while Washington was still alive. No other president has ever had to experience something like that, because no other former president has ever had the prestige that Washington did. It is almost impossible for us to even wrap our minds around how revered and respected he was, even after serving for 8 years. We don't really have anyone like that in the United States today, except maybe Dolly Parton, and she doesn't have any political power. So that's the closest I can think of to sort of being universally liked and adored. So the pressure sort of Washington looming over Adams, over always at his shoulder, was enormous. And the possibility that Washington would speak out against him was always very detrimental to Adams's ability to govern. He also acknowledged that his party was very much split. There was a wing of the party known as the Arch Federalists or the High Federalists that were much more radical. They were aligned with Hamilton and some of the members of the cabinet. And then there was a moderate wing. People like John Marshall and Charles Lee, who was the Attorney General, were much more loyal to Adams. But that split made it really hard for Adams to do anything. Next slide, please. Ultimately, Adams offers a rebuke against Washington, which I think is actually quite fair. So he says Washington ought either to have never gone out of public life, or he ought never to have come in again. Now, to be fair to Washington, Adams did ask him to serve, and Washington wasn't great at saying no when people asked him to serve. However, I think that Washington's conduct in this moment is among the low points of his public service career. He came extraordinarily close to destroying the concept of civilian control over the military, which he had worked so hard to implement for the majority of his life, and had really started, had really created as a thing when he was commander-in-chief of the army during the Revolution. He was unbelievably deferential to the Continental Congress, even when, frankly, they didn't deserve it. He was unbelievably deferential to the Board of War under the Confederation Congress, even when they didn't deserve it. And then he, of course, relinquished power. And when he came back in as president, he was meticulous in making sure there was a distinction between himself as president as a civilian leader and any sort of military activity, to the point where when he went to Boston in his first year in office, a local militia came out and offered to do maneuvers. And he said, I cannot participate in even viewing your military maneuvers because I am a civilian president in charge. I can only march by, which to us sounds like kind of a ridiculous distinction, but it was one that they recognized at the time, and he was so careful to really emphasize. So to me, this is a moment where he is struggling to maintain that divide. And I think it's really worth talking about for a couple of reasons. One, we still struggle with the civil military relations today. We still have civilian control of the military, and yet the relationship is messy and hard. And I actually take a great deal of comfort that if Washington, who was the kind of originator of this thing and the original commander in chief, struggled with it, then no wonder we do today too. Two, I think that it makes Washington's contributions actually more valuable if we also acknowledge his flaws and his failures, because it reminds us that he was very much a fallible human. And fallible humans are going to do bad things, but if they can also do extraordinary things, then that's worth remembering and studying to see how we might replicate that type of creation in our current moment. Lastly, however, towards the end of his life, when Adams ultimately decided to send another peace delegation to France, Washington wrote to Adams and said that he thought it was a very wise decision and he had his support. So while they did not necessarily ever end on good terms, that was one of the last letters that Washington sent Adams before he died. And I think it is important that it ended on that note. Next slide, please. Oh, excellent. We have our next programs. Okay, well, good. I have left lots of time for us to answer questions, and I can see that there are um, a lot of really meaty things here to talk about in the chat. So that is wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Chervinsky, for that. That was so fun to hear about the inner lives of all of these founding fathers. Summer, if you wouldn't mind coming on mic and reading off some of our questions, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Um, so this question I think kind of already gets at your last point, but maybe not. They ask, talents 1 to 7. They don't seem to be skills or talents. It feels more like Adams was rationalizing why Washington was more popular than he was. So is framing this letter as Adams complaining a misread of the document, or is there another way to go about it, especially presenting it to, high school students and K to 8th grade students?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it's some of both. So, I mean, there are things like graceful demeanor, which I think was number 3 on the list, was something that had to be cultivated. So you could say that that was a skill. Height is not a skill. You're right. It's something you're either born with or you're not. There's nothing you can really change. I suppose you can wear lifts, but that's about it. I think partly it is Adams coming to grips with the things that made Washington popular that he could never have. So he was never going to be super wealthy. He was never going to be 6'2". He was, never going to be a Virginian. And that was a process that took a long time for Adams to accept, because you're right, he was quite bitter about the fact that he was not celebrated in the way Washington was. And it wasn't even necessarily because of his presidency, it was more of he had been in public service just as long as Washington. He had, represented the British regulars after the Boston Massacre. He had been at the Continental Congress. He had been on more committees than anyone else in Congress. He had been instrumental in ensuring that Washington was nominated as commander in chief and that Jefferson was the one who drafted the Declaration of Independence. And then he was away from home for years, just as long as Washington was during the war and after. And yet, Americans in both the 18th century and today don't prioritize or valorize diplomatic service in the way that they do military service. And so he was grouchy about that and resented it. And you can kind of see him working through that in the letter.
Okay, somebody else asked, well, do we know how Benjamin Rush responded to the letter, or if he was like, man, you're totally right? Or actually, I don't know if I agree with those talents. You know what I
We
mean?
do. Yes. So, if you all have not already explored, there's a great site called founders.archives.gov that has all of the letters of Franklin, Washington, Adams, Madison, Hamilton, Franklin, Washington, Adams, Madison, Jefferson, uh, There's a lot of them. It's Founders for a reason. Founders.archives.gov. It's free. It has all of the letters. You can see this letter as well as the response. And so Rush does engage in this, and he does talk about, like, yes, these things are true, but didn't he also have these qualities? And Hamilton says this. So, but Rush was often critical of Washington. He had been critical of Washington during the war, and he was critical of Washington during Washington's presidency. So it wasn't like Rush thought that Washington was this godlike figure, and Adams was trying to convince him otherwise.
Okay. Well, I also wanted to ask you something because it seems like the questions are a bit lagging. And I know you said you like to come up with questions yourself. So is there anything that you feel people should know about the document or something that you would like to talk about?
Well, I'm actually seeing a bunch of other open questions here that I think are great. If I can dig into those,
Yes, for sure.
there's one from Leanne Mott about Adams and the presidency, and whether or not David McCullough doesn't give him his due. And this is a great question because, one of the things that people ask me is, kind of like, are you crazy for writing a book about John Adams after David McCullough wrote a book about John Adams? Like, that seems like sort of an insane thing to do. Valid question. So anytime you're writing a one-volume biography of a life as full as John Adams, you're going to have to leave things out. And that's true no matter what. But most biographers leave out the presidency, or they treat the presidency as the low point of his career. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, it's sort of an easy choice. He's sandwiched between Washington and Jefferson, and the legacies that their supporters crafted for them really overpowered Adams. Two, Adams had the very poor fortune to be living at the time of two of the all-time greatest propagandists, which were Hamilton and Jefferson. And they were unbelievably talented. And so when they wrote negatively about Adams, that often stuck. And historians who usually take Hamilton and Jefferson with a grain of salt or a bucket of salt, often take those descriptions at face value. And I'm not totally sure why. The last reason I think is perhaps the most important one. We write history based on the questions we ask. We ask questions based on what we have seen and what we have lived and our experiences. All of the biographies of John Adams were written prior to January 6th, meaning none of them had actually seen a contested transition. And they probably, like me, were taking the peaceful transfer of power for granted, because it's very easy to do that when you are, seeing this process go through smoothly time and time and time again. And so when I saw January 6th happen, I realized that I wanted to know more about where the peaceful transfer of power came from, how it was developed, how it was cultivated, because it's not really written down. And I started looking through those things. And all of a sudden, I started to see all of these little pieces, these little decisions, these little actions that Adams had taken to ensure that the presidency actually survived past Washington, to ensure that someone else could be in this office and to teach Americans how to participate in the transfer process. If I hadn't been asking those questions, I wouldn't have seen those things. And so I don't see my work as a corrective to McCullough. I see it as an addition, because I saw things that he didn't get to or didn't live through to see.
Somebody asked, what military experience, if any, did John Adams have?
He had none. So when he was in Congress, he did serve on the Board of War, which was the committee that basically oversaw the rationing and the supplies and the organization of the army, but he never served in the military. And then in 1778, he was sent to France for his first diplomatic posting. He was in France, he was at The Hague, he was at London, he was back in France, and then he came back. And by the time he was vice president, he was sort of an older man and was not expected to serve in the militia. So he certainly probably had fired a gun. He was taught to fire a musket with his family on his farm for hunting purposes, but he had no military experience, which was something he sometimes felt was something that was lacking, and he certainly thought that Americans thought it was lacking.
Another question. So George Washington dealt with issues with his cabinet, mainly Hamilton and Jefferson. Did Adams's cabinet deal with similar or significant issues?
Excellent question. So I would characterize their issues as quite different, but perhaps both dramatic. Washington intentionally created a cabinet that had a wide diversity of opinions and views. He wanted people who came from different perspectives and different backgrounds and different educations because he wanted people who would come up with different types of solutions to problems. Put another way, he did not want to be surrounded by yes men. It was very important that he had people who did not just agree with him or agree with each other. And so when Jefferson and Hamilton would get into a debate and they would fight over something, that was by design. He did not mind that sort of conflict because he found that type of debate to be quite useful. Hamilton didn't mind that conflict either. It was Jefferson who hated it and was one of the reasons that Jefferson eventually left the cabinet. But Washington did not view that conflict as bad. Adams is very different. Adams kept what I call Washington's sort of B team cabinet, the replacements once the originals had retired. He kept that cabinet, and that cabinet was mostly arch federalists, not all, but mostly. It was a cabinet that was incredibly loyal to Washington, but mostly to Alexander Hamilton, and were not particularly loyal to John Adams. Now, Adams thought that he was doing the right thing because he didn't have any model of replacing a cabinet. There was no precedent of them giving pro forma resignations. He trusted Washington's judgment, and he thought that if Washington thought these were good secretaries, then great. And he worried that if he replaced them, then it would be seen as rebuking Washington's judgment, which is not what he wanted to have happen. And lastly, he didn't know that if he got rid of them, would he be able to fill them with other people? Because it had been very hard for Washington to find replacements because the positions were not particularly prestigious. They weren't as well paid. And so it was hard to get people to do these jobs. So he kept his cabinet, and very quickly they started to try and undermine his administration, to try and figure out ways to pursue their own agenda. Towards the end of the presidency, they campaigned against him. They tried to thwart his diplomacy. It was a real debacle, and really, I think, the main challenge of his presidency, and culminated in him firing Timothy Pickering, Secretary of State, in May of 1800, establishing the precedent that presidents actually can do that because it had not been done before, and it certainly was not written down.
This is an interesting one. So how do Adams's 10 identified virtues of Washington match up with Washington's rules of civility that Washington wrote out for himself when he was a teenager?
That is a very good question. They match up quite well. Now, the rules of civility don't say anything like, marry really wealthy if you can help it, or, be really tall. But it does say things about comportment and how you style yourself and how you dress and kind of restraining your emotions and having graceful manners and not allowing your temper to show. So these were a lot of things that that Washington had been quite meticulous about trying to learn and master when he was a young man.
So this is in reference to your book. A couple of these are. One of them is Hamilton and Jefferson almost undid John Adams' presidency in a way. So why are these two revelations not spoken about much outside of your book?
Well, so I think there are a couple reasons. One, as I said, they were both brilliant propagandists. So they did a really good job of telling their own story in a way that was compelling and powerful, in a way that was persuasive to people. But they also had very devoted proteges, people who kind of worshiped them and kept their tradition alive. and they became stand-ins for political traditions. So when you think of the Federalist Party, though it was not particularly long-lived, it's generally associated with Hamilton, despite the fact that he was never president. It's not associated with John Adams. And Thomas Jefferson was the founder, basically, of the Democratic Republican Party, which went on to kind of morph into the Democratic Party under Jackson. And there has been a Democratic Party since, although its positions and its constituents and what it is has often 180'd back and forth over American history. So it certainly cannot, there's not a direct line. But what that means is that there was not a party tradition to uphold Adams' legacy. So there was a party tradition to uphold Hamilton's legacy and Jefferson's legacy, but not Adams. And so he just kind of was left without successors to tell his story. And the only person that really would have done so was John Quincy Adams. And he felt it was sort of inappropriate because it would clearly be seen as a family project as opposed to a political project.
This one touches on maybe Washington's thought or importance on a civilian-led military. So what do you think Washington's decision to lead the militia during the Whiskey Rebellion, for example, says about his feelings regarding a civilian-led military?
That is an excellent question. Okay, so this is, I think, a little bit more of a nuanced story than is sometimes told. So first, Washington very much intentionally did not use the army. The army was actually out west under the command of Anthony Wayne. And it was fighting against a series of Native American nations out west. But he could have recalled the army, and he did not. Instead, he could have waited for Congress to come back in session to recall the army. Instead, he used a bill that had been passed that allowed the president to call up the local militias in the event of an insurrection or an international invasion, provided a Supreme Court justice has sort of approved the evidence. So he first sent a peace delegation to meet with the rebels to try and come up with a peaceful solution. When that failed, as he thought it would, he got permission from the Supreme Court justice to then call up the militias and send them out. But critically, two things. One, I don't believe he was wearing his uniform. He hadn't worn his uniform as president. He had primarily worn either homespun or velvet or wool suits. I think that if he had put on his uniform, there would have been a lot of commentary about it in the newspapers and people who saw him, and there was not. So to me, that suggests he was in civilian dress. There's a painting of him that was painted the year after. It was not painted contemporaneously. It pictures him in the military uniform, but I think that that is inaccurate. Second, he made sure he turned around before there was any action. So he met up with the militia and he met them up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But then he went back to Philadelphia and they kept marching west under the command of Hamilton and Light Horse Harry Lee. And I think that he did so, A, because of these concerns about the civilian-led military, and B, he knew it would look really bad if the president was arresting a bunch of citizens. So I think that was a very meticulous choice to ensure that that image didn't cloud civil control of the military.
How do you make sense of the juxtaposition of Washington as a diffident or maybe a shy person with his careful cultivation of his public image?
Well, I think they are in a lot of ways the same. So, he knew that he had to put himself forward as a best man, as a leader, as a military leader, as a political leader. But one of the reasons he didn't really like to talk a lot was because he was a bit shy. He was a bit reserved. And he taught himself to do the symbolism of public appearances, but very rarely said much in those spaces and grew comfortable just being there and being present. And that was often enough. So the Constitutional Convention is a great example. He was the president of the convention. He was there every single day. He did not miss a single session. He actually arrived early, and he and the rest of the Virginia and Pennsylvania delegations kind of planned out how they wanted to approach this whole thing. And when the other states arrived, they kind of pulled one over on them because they had this whole plan laid out and no one else was really as prepared. But as president, he either sat up in the front of the room on the raised dais or he sat with the Virginia delegation. And he only spoke once towards the end of the session, but he voted with the Virginia delegation. So people would have known what he thought about things, and he socialized with people towards the end of the day after every day's session. So he was able to sort of express himself and demonstrate without having to be a public speaker. I think there is evidence to suggest later on in his life that there are people he liked spending time with. It wasn't that he didn't like people. I think we might think of him today as an introvert, like he just preferred sometimes to be in small groups or to be by himself, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't capable of doing that outward presentation.
And I guess this is a good one because I mean, honest myself, I don't necessarily know the answer to this question. Maybe I should. How did George Washington first get into politics?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So I would argue that he was sort of angling for politics very early on, because when he had some military misadventures, he would write up a description of them and he actually had them published in Virginia to tell his side of the story. Now, that was partly angling for a military commission. At that point, he was still wanting to be in the British forces, but as military historians would tell you, military commissions were quite political. When he really became an actual real politician, it was after his marriage to Martha. At that point, he was quite wealthy because he had inherited Mount Vernon from his older half brother Lawrence and Lawrence's widow, and then he married Martha. So he had this enormous fortune. And he stood for, I believe, a position in the House of Burgesses. I will confess, some of my early positions are a little bit fuzzier. In the House of Burgesses in the Virginia legislature, and this is, of course, the colonial legislature. So this is a part of the imperial system. But he was very early on to start voicing dissatisfaction with the British, and we typically can point to two things. One, it was his experience in the armed forces, where he was clearly treated as a second-class citizen, and he resented that very much. And then two, it was through his economic purchases, because he realized that what's called the mercantilist system of the British Empire, meaning all of the purchases are supposed to stay within the imperial family, was very disadvantageous to the colonists, and again, forcing them into sort of second-class economic citizenship. So he was pretty resentful about those things long before some of the political conflicts started. He did serve many years in the Virginia legislature, almost as long as I think he was in the military, if I'm remembering correctly. And while he was not, again, much of a speaker, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he did have a lot of influence in sort of the backbenching personalities, relationships during that time.
Right, I think we should leave it there for time. Thank you so much, Dr. Chervinsky, for sharing your vast expertise with us. This was so excellent and so educational. Just a quick plug for some of our upcoming programs. We have an Inside the Vault on March 6th with Dr. Allison Rose Jefferson. He'll be talking about Black land ownership and the American dream through the story of Eureka Villa. I think that's going to be really interesting. We've also got one coming up on April 3rd. We're talking about the battles of Lexington and Concord and a bit about the early intelligence operations with Dr. Brooke Barbier. And this coming Sunday, February 9th at 2 p.m. Eastern, we have Dr. Jonathan White on Book Breaks talking about his book, A Great and Good Man, Rare Firsthand Accounts of Abraham Lincoln. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next month.